Sarah Chen moved through the night shift at Mercy General in Raleigh with the invisible efficiency of someone trained to disappear. Her movements were precise, checking monitors in the cold fluorescent wash, documenting vitals with handwriting so meticulous it looked printed. The antiseptic smell mingled with floor wax as she passed the nurse's station at 2,247 hours, her badge hanging silent against her scrubs, her Navy training compressed into muscle memory so deep that even her own reflection seemed surprised when she caught it in a darkened window. She had been a senior chief petty officer. That part of her life lived now only in the faded 2nd Marine Division patch sewn inside her scrub jacket lining, fabric so worn the embroidered anchor had turned grey, threads loose at the edges. She touched it once when alone in the supply closet, her calloused fingers finding the familiar shape the way a monk finds prayer beads. Then she stepped back into the ICU like a ghost stepping back into the living world, where nobody asked questions and nobody noticed the scars on her hands that matched battlefield sutures. The night shift was her territory. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., when the hospital slowed to a different rhythm, when the chaos of daytime rounds dissolved into something quieter, more honest. The machines breathed their mechanical rhythms. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant song. Sarah moved between rooms with her tablet, her eyes catching details others missed, a subtle change in oxygen saturation, a shift in ventilator compliance, the barely perceptible rattle that meant fluid was moving where it shouldn't be moving. Room 4 was at the end of the west corridor. Marine General James Rawlings had been admitted 4 days ago, his left hemisphere striped with an ischemic stroke that had stolen his voice and left him somewhere between waking and the deep place where no dreams came. His forearm rested on top of the blanket, scarred, still muscular at 72, with a faded tattoo inked in navy blue across the inside of his wrist. Sarah's call sign. Document. From Kandahar, 2011. From a dust storm where 17 Marines had come in and only 16 left on the medevac helicopter. She had no idea the general was awake inside that comatose body, his eyes closed but his mind somewhere very far away, remembering. She checked his lines, the NG tube, the Foley, the arterial line in his left radial artery feeding numbers to the monitor in real time. His vital signs were stable. Stroke patients were like that sometimes. The brain swelled, then it didn't. The crisis passed, and you were left with a body that still breathed but a mind you couldn't reach. Sarah adjusted his position, supporting his left side with pillows, her movements economical. No wasted effort. Never wasted effort. Her hands moved on their own, doing what hands trained for trauma do, assess, correct, document. At 0023 hours, Dr. Sterling arrived for his rounds. He was a thin man with expensive shoes and a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light every time he wrote notes. His voice had the particular music of someone accustomed to being obeyed, not harsh, just assuming. He moved through the ICU like he owned it, stopping at each bedside long enough to review the monitors, scan the charts, make his decisions. Most of the nurses scattered when Sterling entered. They knew his moods. They knew that questions were not welcome, that his authority was not a thing to be tested. Sarah did not scatter. She was documenting her 0015 assessment when he appeared, her fingers moving across the tablet screen with practiced speed. She had learned long ago that being invisible meant being efficient. No drama. No emotion. Just the work. Sterling stopped at the nurse's station and watched her. She felt it the way you feel eyes on your back in a dark room, not seeing it, but knowing it was there. She did not look up. She continued typing, her jaw working through the data, heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, urine output, medication administration, patient responses. Every number accurate. Every detail documented with the precision of someone who understood that paperwork could save lives or end them, depending on who was reading it. New overnight order on the ventilator, Sterling said. His voice was not cruel yet. It was simply stating facts. Rawlings is stable. Recommend the advanced model with integrated monitoring. Item number RV 4800X. Sarah's fingers stilled. She turned to face him. Sterling was already moving toward the next room, but she could see the set of his shoulders, the way they didn't tense, the way he didn't even glance back. He was certain. The ventilator order would be processed. Questions would not be asked. She opened the supply catalog on her tablet and searched the model number. The RV Air 4800X cost $11,800. The patient was breathing at a rate of 12 per minute with oxygen saturation at 96% on a 5-year-old machine that cost $4,200 and functioned perfectly. She scrolled through the specifications. The new machine had 3 additional monitoring features that the current patient did not need. The current patient was stable. The current patient was not trending toward crisis. Sarah had spent 12 years in Navy medicine. She had worked triage on a destroyer off the coast of Dubai. She had performed emergency procedures in field hospitals in Helmand province. She had learned the difference between what was necessary and what was profitable, and this ventilator was not necessary. She typed a message to the supply company contact listed on the order, question on RV Air 4800X assignment to room 4. Patient currently stable on existing equipment. Can you confirm clinical justification for upgrade? At 00 for 7 hours, Sterling's phone buzzed. Sarah watched from the corner of her vision as he read the message, as his face made a small shift, not anger yet, but the calculation of someone whose mathematics had just been interrupted. He looked up from his phone. He looked at Sarah. His eyes were the color of cold steel. He did not approach her. He simply stood there, 30 feet away, and let her see that she had made a mistake. Not a clinical mistake. A different kind of mistake entirely. Then he turned and walked out of the ICU. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she finished her documentation. Not from fear. From something else. The recognition of patterns. The understanding that she had just questioned a decision that was not meant to be questioned, from a man who was not accustomed to being questioned. She had spent 3 years trying to disappear into this job, into the anonymity of night shifts and meticulous charts and being nobody special. She had buried the senior chief petty officer so deep that even her own voice sounded like someone else's when she spoke. She pressed her hand to the patch inside her jacket and held it there for 6 seconds. Then she let go. At 0312 hours, the break room was empty except for Sarah. She sat with lukewarm coffee and a protein bar, her eyes fixed on the far wall where someone had taped a photo of a mountain landscape. The fluorescent lights above her head buzzed with a frequency that made her temples ache. Through the doorway, she could hear the muffled sound of the nursing station, someone laughing, someone else asking about a patient's lab results, the ordinary sounds of people who belonged here. The moment she sat down, the laughter stopped. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge it. She simply existed in the break room, occupying space, drinking her coffee, and sensing the exact moment when one by one, the nurses who had been there found reasons to leave. A chart to check. A medication to pull. A patient who needed something. They filed out like water finding the cracks in a dam, moving away from the table where Sarah sat alone. By 0318 hours, the break room was empty again. Sterling knew. She understood this with sudden clarity. He knew about the ventilator question, and he had already begun the work of making her isolation visible. The supply company message would be explained away. The order would go through. And Sarah would be the problem, the new nurse who didn't understand hospital protocols, who questioned doctors' orders, who didn't yet understand her place in the hierarchy. She finished her coffee and stood up, her movement steady. Her hands were no longer trembling. She had been trained for much worse than this, trained to keep moving when everything around you was collapsing, trained to complete the mission when the mission was all that mattered. A medical supply company kickback was a small thing compared to what she had already survived. She returned to the ICU at 0326 hours and found room for exactly as she had left it, Marine General Rawlings breathing quietly, his monitors displaying the steady rhythm of a man whose body was fighting while his mind slept somewhere beyond reach. She checked every line. She checked every setting. She reviewed his medication administration record and confirmed that everything was exactly as it should be. She did not know that inside that comatose body, something was beginning to change. Morning rounds at Mercy General started at 6:45, and Dr. Sterling moved through the ICU like a man who owned every hallway in it. Sarah had learned to recognize the precise angle of his shoulders when he was hunting, that forward lean, that calculated slowness, the way his eyes scanned for an audience. Room 4 was his target. The Marine General lay motionless in the bed, monitors casting their pale blue light across his sleeping face, and standing beside him were the two people Sterling needed, the General's daughter, Rebecca, her hand on the bed rail, and his son Marcus, arms crossed, eyes hollow with the kind of exhaustion that came from watching a parent disappear into stillness. Sarah was checking the ventilator settings when she heard him. Not his words yet, his voice. Low. Carrying. The kind of sound designed to make people turn. Nurse Chen. Not a greeting. A summons. She turned. Sterling stood in the doorway with his attending physician shadow, Dr. Patel, whose face already wore that careful neutrality of someone about to witness something uncomfortable. Behind them, two residents craned their necks. "Good morning, Doctor," Sarah said. Her hands remained steady on the ventilator tubing. "The patient's oxygenation is stable at 94%, vent settings are unchanged from last night, and his urine output is tracking appropriately." Sterling stepped into the room. The fluorescent panels above cast him in surgical white, and he moved toward the bedside with the confidence of someone about to perform. His voice changed, louder now, pitched for the room and the hallway beyond it. "Would you care to explain your utterly incompetent assessment from last night?" The silence that followed was immediate. Rebecca's hand froze on the bed rail. Marcus's jaw tightened. Dr. Patel's eyes closed for just a fraction of a second. "Doctor, I'm not sure," Sarah began. "You questioned a ventilator order I specifically approved," Sterling continued, talking over her, his voice riding roughshod across her words like tank treads on pavement. "Are you suggesting you know more than a physician with 20 years of experience? That your nursing intuition somehow supersedes my clinical judgment?" Sarah's hands were still. She did not flush. She did not look away. "I was clarifying the medical necessity for the equipment upgrade, since the patient was maintaining adequate oxygen saturation with the standard ventilator. For a piece of equipment you clearly don't understand." Sterling turned slightly toward Rebecca and Marcus, drawing them into his performance. "This is exactly the kind of dangerous judgment I've been documenting. Nurses who think they're clinicians. Who second-guess physician orders. Who put patients at risk with their overreach." Rebecca's eyes widened. Not with anger, with pity. That was the worst part. Not anger, which was honest. Pity meant he'd won the frame. He'd made her not a nurse who asked good questions, but a nurse who was dangerous. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "Thank you for the correction." Sterling smiled. Not the smile of a doctor who'd clarified something. The smile of someone who'd just watched someone fold. He turned and left, Dr. Patel trailing like a satellite in his orbit, and the residents scattered like startled birds. Rebecca squeezed her son's arm. Neither of them looked at Sarah again. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 hours later. By 9 in the morning, Sterling had printed a formal write-up on hospital letterhead and placed it on the unit board, the board where the nurses gathered for shift reports, where families read posted announcements, where every member of the care team would see it. The paper was pristine white with a red line border, and the word seemed to glow with official weight. Formal disciplinary notice. To Nurse Sarah Chen, RN. From Dr. James Sterling, MD. Insubordination and poor clinical judgment. Date: today. Incident: Nurse Chen has questioned physician orders regarding patient care, demonstrating insubordination and lack of appropriate respect for the physician-nurse hierarchy. This represents a pattern of unsafe practice and has been documented in the permanent employee record. 3 exclamation points marked the margins. His signature was sharp, angular, the signature of a man who'd learned how to weaponize a pen. Sarah read it once. Then she stepped away and began her charting. She did not take it down. She did not write a response. She did not cry in the supply closet, though the supply closet was right there, dark and quiet and adorable. She simply noted it, the way a sentry notes an approaching storm, and continued her rounds with her face smooth and her hand steady and her internal compass pointing nowhere in particular. By lunchtime, the mathematics of isolation had become absolute. She sat in the break room at 12:15 with a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria, turkey, Swiss, mustard on wheat, and a thermos of black coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. 3 nurses at the corner table stood simultaneously, exchanging glances. They carried their trays to the hallway without speaking. 2 respiratory therapists followed. Then a unit secretary. Within 90 seconds, the break room had emptied as if a silent alarm had sounded. Sarah sat alone under the humming fluorescent fixtures, the sandwich in her hands, her face a mask of complete indifference. She took one bite. Chewed slowly. Swallowed. Took another bite. A woman eating lunch alone was not a tragedy. It was simply a fact of the shift. The smell of old coffee and microwaved lasagna hung in the air like a held breath. Her hands did not tremble. Her throat did not tighten. She had once held a corpsman's hand as he bled out on a stretcher in Kandahar, and that corpsman had squeezed her fingers and smiled, actually smiled, and whispered that he'd made peace with it before the morphine carried him away. A quiet lunch was not hardship. It was barely worth noticing. But the mind kept score anyway. The third incident came at 3:30, at shift change, when the outgoing day shift was handing off to nights and the ICU was in that strange transitional moment where it belonged to no one. Sarah was restocking the supply closet on the west side of the unit, replacing used airway management kits and checking expiration dates on emergency medications. Her movements were precise, efficient, the movements of someone trained to know exactly where everything should be and why. Sterling appeared without preamble. He was still in his street clothes, charcoal suit, burgundy tie, the clothing of a doctor who'd already finished his rounds and decided to stay for a moment longer, perhaps to savor something. He turned the corner and moved directly toward her, and the hallway suddenly felt narrower, the walls closer, though Sarah's breathing did not change. "You know what you are, clipboard." His voice was almost conversational, almost friendly, which made it worse than if it had been angry. "A liability. You think your perfect little charts make you special? Your neat handwriting and your careful assessments. You're a glorified bedpan technician who doesn't know her place. Clipboard." He'd started using the nickname yesterday. She'd heard it whispered by residents, picked up by a few nurses who wanted to seem aligned with power. A woman who organized, who counted, who didn't understand the creative intuition of real medicine. A woman whose job was to clean up and document, not to think. Sarah finished arranging the intubation kits on the shelf. Row by row. Smallest to largest. Everything in its order. "The problem with you," Sterling continued, "is that you've gotten comfortable thinking you're more than you are. That experience in the Navy, or wherever you served, or whatever made you think you could." He stopped. Something in his sentence had missed its target. Sarah had turned to face him, and her eyes met his directly, and for just a moment, something true showed through. Not anger. Not fear. Something older. Something that had survived things he couldn't name. A single tear escaped from her left eye. Not a sob. Not a cascade. One tear, clean and precise, which she wiped away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact for a single second. "I've carried dying men through worse storms than you, Doctor," she said quietly. "This doesn't even register." The hallway went absolutely still. Sound died. The ventilators seemed to pause. The monitor's beeping felt impossibly far away. Sterling's smile froze for a moment, just a moment, and then reformed itself into something harder. He stared at her. Really stared, as if seeing her for the first time, as if something in that quiet sentence had registered as a problem beyond his current calculations. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket. "We'll see how much you can register," he said. He was already dialing as he walked away, his voice dropping slightly, his tone shifting to something more deferential, the voice he used with important people. "Dr. Patel?" It's Sterling. I need to schedule an urgent meeting about Nurse Chen. I'd like to have documentation in place. Yes, today if possible. Thank you. And that's when the real nightmare began. The monitor screamed at 0300 hours. Sarah's eyes snapped open before the alarm fully registered. 3 years of night shifts had trained her body to read the ICU's electrical language better than most cardiologists. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory pulling her to wardroom for where Marine General Rawlings lay comatose, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator that had kept him breathing since the stroke. The heart rate was climbing. 118, 127. But it was the muffled quality of the heart sounds that told her everything. Not bradycardia. Not dysrhythmia. Something worse. Something that killed men in minutes if you hesitated. Tension pneumothorax. The clinical picture assembled itself in her mind with the same certainty she'd used to diagnose hemorrhagic shock in a Marine with an exit wound the size of a grapefruit in Kandahar dust. The ventilator was pushing air into his lungs. The air had nowhere to go. It was building pressure. Collapsing the right lung. Compressing the heart. Pushing it sideways until it couldn't pump. She reached the crash cart without a thought. Grabbed the 14-gauge needle, the thick angiocath designed for exactly this moment, for the 4 seconds that separated saving a life from losing one. The needle felt like an extension of her hand, the same way her rifle had felt, the same way the trauma shears hanging from her pocket had felt during every combat deployment. I'm performing needle decompression, she said, not asking. Telling. That's when Dr. Sterling materialized in the doorway, and behind him came the others. 5 more doctors. Then a 6th. 7 total, their white coats blocking the light from the hallway, their faces arranged in expressions that ranged from confusion to something darker. Sterling's face was a masterclass in controlled fury. He'd called them in. This was deliberate. Step back, one of them said. Dr. Patel, the ICU attending. His voice wasn't hostile. It was worse, it was cautious, the way you speak to someone unstable. Patient is decompensating, Sarah said. Right-sided tension pneumothorax. O2 sat at 71 and falling. If I don't decompress in the next 60 seconds, he's going into cardiac arrest. Sterling moved, and his movement was a statement. He crossed his arms. He planted himself directly between Sarah and the bedside. His mouth opened, and when the words came out, they were designed to freeze her in place, to make her question her own training, her own eyes, her own hands. A nurse under investigation doesn't touch critical patients. That's protocol. That's law. You move toward this bed, you're assaulting medical staff. The words hung in the ICU air like a challenge. Around her, the other 6 doctors shifted. Some looked away. Some looked at Sterling. None of them moved to help. None of them moved to stop her. The general's oxygen saturation hit 68. Sarah took one measured breath, the kind of breath she'd learned to take before breaching a door, before making a call that meant life or death for men depending on her judgment. Her posture shifted. Her weight redistributed. She didn't tense up. That would be wasted energy. Instead, her body found the balanced, economical stillness of someone trained under fire, someone who had learned that hesitation was the only real enemy. Move, she said. Not a plea. Not a question. A command. Sterling laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had never experienced consequences, who believed his institution and his allies and his insurance premiums could shield him from everything. Or what? Clipboard. Sarah didn't answer. Answers were for people with time. She pivoted left, using the microsecond of Sterling's laugh to slip past Dr. Patel's shoulder before he could think to block her. She spun around Dr. Morrison's reaching hand, muscle memory reading his angle of approach and calculating the exact vector to avoid contact. In one fluid motion, she reached the bedside. Sterling lunged. His hand came for her arm. She was already positioning the needle. "If you touch me while I'm performing an emergency procedure, that's assault," she said without turning her head. Her voice had changed. The timid night nurse was gone. What remained was something none of them recognized, the voice of someone trained to function in chaos, to give orders in the kind of silence that comes after artillery fire. The needle punctured the skin at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The angle was perfect. The depth was perfect. Everything about her hands was perfect because her hands had done this before, in darkness, under fire, while men screamed. The hiss of released air came like an answer. Immediate. Unmistakable. The sound of a pneumothorax decompressing, of pressure equalizing, of a man's heart being allowed to pump again. Sarah withdrew the needle with textbook precision. She didn't rush. She didn't shake. She moved with the terrifying fluid grace of someone who understood that the moment after saving a life was still part of the procedure, and procedure was everything. The oxygen saturation stabilized. 76, 79. 83, 87. The heart rate began its descent. 115, 103. The general's face, still comatose, still unconscious, had been pulled back from the edge. Dr. Lee stared at the monitor. His mouth opened slightly. Closed. Dr. Gutierrez exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that meant he understood what had just happened, that a nurse with no authority, no credential for this particular emergency, had done something none of the 7 doctors in that room would have done, had done it faster than any of them could have conceptualized, had done it perfectly. Sterling's face went from red to white. The color drained like someone had opened a valve. He pulled out his phone before anyone else moved. "Get me the board president. Now. I don't care what time it is. Tell him it's Dr. Sterling. Tell him there's been an incident." He was already making the calculations, already moving through his network like a man who understood that if he didn't control the narrative in the next 10 minutes, the narrative would control him. He looked at the other 6 doctors. His voice was steady. Cold. "You all witnessed a nurse assault medical staff and perform an unauthorized procedure. Document everything. Names, times, exact language. I want it on my desk by shift change." Dr. Patel looked away. 3 more calls came in rapid succession. One to the nursing school where Sarah had completed her credentials, Sterling's voice changing to sound concerned, confused, a colleague checking on something troubling. One to the state licensing board investigator he golfed with every Sunday, the conversation clipped and urgent. One to hospital legal, where he spoke in the measured tones of a man reporting a potential liability. The charge nurse appeared at the doorway with 2 security guards. Their presence filled the space like a decision that had already been made, like Sarah's clinical judgment and the rising oxygen saturation and the general stabilizing vital signs were irrelevant, less relevant than protocol, less relevant than the phone call Sterling had just made, less relevant than 7 doctors' silence. "Nurse Chen," the charge nurse said, and her voice was gentle, which was worse than anger. "You need to come with us." Sarah looked at the general. His chest was rising and falling with better rhythm now, the ventilator working with his body instead of against it, the pressure released, the crisis averted. She looked at the monitor one more time, all the numbers moving in the right direction, all of it because of 4 seconds and 1 needle in her hands. Then she turned away from the bed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came in the silence that followed, the way none of the 7 doctors met her eyes as she walked past them, the way Sterling was already on his phone again with a second set of calls, the way the charge nurse's expression suggested that saving a man's life in the ICU had somehow become the wrong choice, somehow become the thing that required an escort from the building, that required investigation, that required the state board's involvement. As she walked toward the exit, the fluorescent lights overhead hummed their indifferent mechanical song, the sound of a system running exactly as designed, of institutions protecting themselves, of a man's phone calls moving faster through the hospital's corridors than the truth ever could. The parking lot awaited. Raleigh's October rain fell in sheets that looked like they could wash everything clean. They couldn't. The charge nurse appeared at the ICU entrance at 0312 hours with 2 security officers flanking her shoulders. Her name was Donna, 23 years on the night shift, and she wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. The monitor beside General Rawlings' bed still climbed, oxygen saturation now at 94%, stable, the crisis already dissolving into the past tense. Sarah had moved away from the bedside the moment the needle decompression succeeded, her hands already pulling the gloves off, because a professional knew when to step back and let the system reassert itself. Dr. Sterling stood near the doorway, his phone already pressed to his ear, his face the color of old drywall. Donna's voice came out careful, rehearsed. "We need you to step away from the unit." Not a request. Sarah didn't respond. She simply nodded once, a gesture so minimal it barely registered, and moved toward the hallway. The security officers flanked her like she was a threat to the hospital's infrastructure instead of its salvation. One of them, a man built like a fire safe with a name tag reading Rodriguez, kept his hand near his radio but said nothing. They walked her through the pre-dawn corridors where the fluorescent tubes cast everything in shades of surgical gray. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. Rodriguez asked for it at the employee exit. She unclipped it and held it out, watching it rest in his palm for a moment before he nodded her through the glass doors. The parking lot was empty except for her Honda Civic and 3 scattered vehicles belonging to graveyard staff who still had 3 hours left on their shifts. Rain hammered the asphalt like someone was angry at the ground. Sarah sat in the driver's seat with the door open for 90 seconds, watching water stream down the windshield, then pulled the door closed and turned the key. The engine caught. She didn't drive anywhere. She just sat there with her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the residual tremor in her fingers, not fear, not shock, but the chemical aftermath of adrenaline converting back to baseline. Her heart rate was probably still elevated. Her pupils were probably still blown. But her breathing was steady. She'd learned that in Kandahar, that you could separate your body's panic response from your actual state of mind, that composure was something you could maintain like a standing order. For hours passed. The sun came up behind clouds the color of wet concrete. Her phone buzzed once around 0600 hours. A text from the break room WhatsApp group, "Everyone okay after last night?" She didn't respond. She didn't look at the other messages. She knew what they would say, the careful distance, the sudden absence of solidarity, the professional equivalent of a social quarantine. This was the price of being the outsider who questioned things. This was what happened to people who made other people look bad. At 0900 hours, hospital administrator Patricia Walsh called. The call went to voicemail. At 1015 hours, another call. Voicemail again. Sarah's phone showed 7 missed calls by 10:45 hours. She turned it off. The rain kept coming. She watched it stream down the windshield in patterns that looked almost like intention, like the water was trying to write something on the glass. Her hand stayed on the steering wheel. She didn't move them. She didn't adjust the seat. She didn't start the engine again. Sometime around noon, a hospital maintenance worker with a cart full of supplies passed by her car and glanced at her through the window. She saw him hesitate, saw the moment he decided not to approach. People could sense damage the way animals sensed fear. They could feel the gravity well around someone whose life had just collapsed. He kept walking. That evening, Sarah stood in Oak Hill Cemetery in Raleigh's Eastern District, rain falling in sheets that bent the headstones into wavering shapes. Marcus Chen's grave was in the 3rd row, the marble still relatively new, 3 years wasn't that long in a cemetery's estimation. The stone read TSSGT Marcus Chen, USMC, beloved husband with dates carved below that added up to 34 years on Earth. She knelt in the mud without thinking about it, water soaking through her jeans instantly. Her voice, when she finally spoke, came out like something broken. I ran from who I was. The rain was loud enough that she could almost believe nobody else would hear. After you died in that convoy. After the IED took you. I couldn't be Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen anymore. Every explosion sound in my dreams felt like the one that took you from me. So I disappeared. I chose to hide. Her hands, those steady hands that had performed a needle decompression in 4 seconds, now trembled as they pressed against the wet grass. I became a quiet nurse. I told myself I was healing people. I told myself that was enough. I didn't tell your family where I went. I didn't tell anyone. I left the uniform in a box in a closet and I pretended that if I didn't wear it, maybe the pain would get smaller. Water ran down her face, mixing with rain until she couldn't distinguish between tears and storm. And now I can't even save one person. One general. One man who saved my life once when I was young and reckless and still believed I mattered. She pressed her forehead against the headstone. The marble was cold and slick. The PTSD made me weak. I walked away from my rank and my brothers and my duty because I couldn't handle the weight of what I'd seen. And last night when it mattered, when someone needed the person I used to be, I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't strong enough. I failed you. I failed the general. I failed every Marine who believed in that call sign. Her voice cracked like ice on a frozen lake. I failed myself. She stayed at the grave for 20 minutes while rain fell harder, until her phone, powered back on in the car, showed a voicemail from Administrator Walsh marked urgent. She didn't listen to it in the cemetery. She sat in the car again, hands still shaking, and pressed play. Walsh's voice came through carefully composed, the tone of someone reading from a prepared script. Sarah, I need you to come in tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a formal termination meeting. Please bring any personal items from your locker. You're to have no contact with hospital staff or patients. The voicemail ended. Sarah set the phone on the passenger seat and watched rain stream down the windows again. Tomorrow at 11 they would make it official. The hospital board had likely already made the decision at sunrise. Dr. Sterling would have filed his documentation. 7 doctors would have signed witness statements. The state licensing board would already have a file folder open with her name on it. This was what happened when you challenged the system. The system broke you. 43 minutes away, in his home office in North Raleigh, Dr. Sterling sat with his laptop open and his cell phone pressed to his ear. The first call had gone to Hospital Board President Richard Havens at 0315 hours, just minutes after security escorted Sarah from the building. Sterling had been careful with his words, regretful, concerned, protective of the institution. I'm deeply troubled, Richard. That nurse put 7 doctors in a position where we had to physically restrain her from interfering with patient care. She's clearly experiencing a psychotic break. I'm documenting everything, but for liability purposes, we need to move fast. Havens, sleep-deprived and anxious about hospital liability, had agreed immediately. I'll call the board. We'll fast-track the termination. The second call had gone to Dr. Marcus Whitfield at the University of North Carolina School of Nursing, the department chair where Sarah had completed her RN degree 15 years ago. Sterling had been delicate here too, careful to sound regretful rather than vindictive. I'm calling as a professional courtesy. We've had to take action against a former student of yours, Sarah Chen. Multiple concerning incidents. I'm wondering if you ever noted any psychological instability during her time with you. Whitfield, protective of his institution's reputation, had been eager to distance himself. That was years ago. I don't recall any issues, but I'll note the inquiry in case there's future contact. Sterling knew that single note would plant a seed of doubt that would bloom into red flags on any background check. The third call, made at 08 for 7 hours while drinking his second espresso, had gone to his golf partner, Tom Hartley, the state nursing board investigator who Sherman had been seeing every Sunday morning for the past 18 months. The call was friendly, casual, the voice of one professional reaching out to another with concerning information. Tom, I've got a sensitive situation. A night shift nurse at Mercy General has been displaying increasingly erratic behavior. I'm not trying to jump to conclusions, but I'd feel better if your office was aware. Maybe a proactive inquiry. Hartley had taken down the details. By Monday morning, Sarah Chen would have a file opened with the state nursing board. By the end of the week, she'd have received a letter requesting documentation of her current fitness to practice. Dr. Sterling set his phone down on his desk and smiled at his reflection in the darkened monitor. He'd learned long ago that direct confrontation was for people without resources. The system, the board, the colleagues, the regulatory apparatus, this was how you neutralized a problem. You didn't need to raise your voice. You didn't need to make threats. You simply made a few calls to the right people, planted the right seeds, and let institutional momentum do the work. By the time Sarah Chen realized what was happening, her career would already be over. The reputation would be destroyed. The nursing schools would have notes in her file. The licensing board would have questions that could take years to resolve. And all of it would be perfectly legal. All of it would be documented. All of it would be defensible in any investigation because technically he'd done nothing but report his concerns. The general would be fine that needle decompression had actually worked, which was unfortunate, but it didn't matter. The hospital would protect itself. The story would be that a mentally unstable nurse had caused a dangerous scene and had been appropriately removed from the unit. And Dr. Nathan Sterling, chief of the ICU at Mercy General, would continue his $730,000 annual salary, his arrangement with a medical supply company, and his golf games every Sunday morning. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the terrible irony that was about to come unraveling, the thing that Sterling couldn't possibly know as he sat in his home office in the Raleigh dawn, sipping espresso and making phone calls. He couldn't know that the Marine General in Room 4, the one lying comatose with a tattoo on his forearm that read Doc Chen in faded ink from a dust storm in 2011, was about to wake up. And when he did, he was going to say her name. At 1100 hours, the administrator's office door burst open and Emma Rawlings stood breathless in the doorway, her face flushed, her hands trembling as she gripped a medical file. Sarah was mid-signature on the termination paperwork when Emma's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He woke up. My father woke up. The administrator's pen froze. Emma stepped forward, her eyes locked on Sarah. He's been saying one word over and over. Document. Just document. Sarah didn't move. She didn't blink. The room seemed to compress around them, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in pale white, the air conditioning hum filling the space where nobody knew what to say. Emma opened the medical file with hands that shook slightly, her voice dropping to something fragile. When I was 8 years old, my dad told me about a Navy corpsman in Kandahar. A senior chief who ran into fire to pull wounded Marines out of a kill zone. He said this woman saved half his unit. He said he'd never forget her name. Emma's eyes found Sarah's. He got a tattoo. In 2011. He's had it for 13 years. She turned the file toward Sarah, pointing to the entry where her father had written, decades ago, in his own handwriting, * Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Bronze Star with Valor. Kandahar, 2011. Never found her again. **. The word sat there like a confession nobody had been allowed to make until now. Sarah's hand moved to her chest, then stopped. She didn't speak. Her composure held like a dam holding back an ocean, but her jaw tightened just enough to be visible to someone who knew how to read the language of soldiers. The next voice came from the hallway. A man's voice. Deep. Measured. Carrying the kind of authority that made doors seem smaller. Is Nurse Chen in this office? A SEAL Team 3 leader, call sign Breaker, stepped through the doorway in full dress uniform. Behind him came 2 more in navy dress blues, their bearing radiating the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Breaker's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made people listen. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. I'm here on behalf of the Joint Special Operations Command. He stepped forward and his presence made the air pressure change, as if the room had physically shifted. I'm standing here to verify 17 documented saves under fire during Operation Enduring Freedom, Helm and Province, 2011. 3 Navy Commendation Medals. He paused. Each word landed like a footstep. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. The administrator's face had gone the color of old concrete. And a Bronze Star with Valor for actions above and beyond the call of duty in direct combat. Breaker looked directly at the administrator. You terminated this woman. The door opened again. A woman in a dark suit entered, her credentials reading Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Pentagon Liaison. Her voice carried the weight of official machinery. I'm here to inform you that Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen saved a 2-star general in combat in 2011. She saved him again last night in this hospital. She looked at the termination paperwork on the desk. Dr. Sterling's actions against her are now part of a federal fraud investigation. The liaison turned to Sarah. The general wants to thank you personally. He's being transferred to Bethesda Naval Medical Center for recovery. He asked me to tell you he never stopped looking. In that moment, the office went completely silent except for the sound of the air conditioning, a low whisper like wind through canyon walls. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. The general's stable. Stable and awake, the liaison said. He asked for you by name. What happened next moved with the velocity of institutional collapse. By noon, a federal investigator from TSICE arrived at Mercy General with 2 analysts carrying 3 file boxes. Dr. Sterling was pulled into a conference room. The investigator, a woman named Torres with the voice of someone who'd spent 15 years unraveling fraud, laid out spreadsheets on the table in front of him. His neck flushed red before she even spoke. Dr. Sterling, we need to discuss your billing practices. You've systematically overbilled ICU services for the past 4 years. Equipment costs inflated by 400% on average. Medic Supply Corporation kickback arrangement. $23,000 in unauthorized commission payments. She slid a document across the table. You attempted to terminate the only staff member who questioned these orders. Sterling's hands began to shake. This is a misunderstanding, I was following standard. You don't get to finish that sentence, Torres said quietly. Her voice was steady as surgical steel. Your actions directly resulted in federal investigation of this institution. You're suspended pending criminal charges. By 1400 hours, CNN had a satellite truck in the parking lot. The story broke on cable news. Decorated Navy corpsman fired after saving Marine General, hospital investigating fraud at Mercy General Raleigh. Sterling's face appeared on screens across the nation. Not the version he wanted. The story of a man protecting corruption. By 1430, his personal attorney arrived looking like someone who'd just realized how deep the hole went. The State Medical Board opened an investigation at 1445. Sterling's office was sealed with yellow tape by 1500. His hospital credentials were deactivated. The other 6 doctors who'd stood with him, who'd blocked Sarah's access to her patient, released a joint statement through their attorneys by 1530. We were following Dr. Sterling's directive based on his misrepresentation of Nurse Chen's qualifications. We deeply regret our role in preventing appropriate patient care. None of them would return his calls. At 1800 hours, Board President Walsh terminated Sterling's employment in the hospital cafeteria during the dinner rush. Staff from all departments had gathered, drawn by the gravity of what was about to happen. Phones were recording. Voices were silent except for the soft clink of silverware and the hum of the vending machines. Walsh's voice cut through the noise like a command echoing off tile in a corridor where nobody dared breathe. Dr. Nathan Sterling, effective immediately, your privileges at Mercy General are revoked. Your actions endangered a patient. You defamed a decorated veteran. You brought federal investigation to this institution. Walsh's eyes were cold. Security will escort you out. Sterling's face had gone grey. The confident surgeon, the man who'd weaponized his position against a woman half his size, looked like someone watching his entire world compress into a single moment of reckoning. 2 guards flanked him. The cafeteria was silent except for his footsteps echoing on tile as he was walked toward the exit, every person in that room bearing witness to what happened when you tried to crush someone who'd already survived actual fire. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the Naval Medical Conference Center in Norfolk, Virginia, wearing her Navy Senior Chief Petty Officer dress blues. The ribbons on her chest caught the light: Bronze Star, Navy Commendation Medals, Purple Hearts, each one a story written in service and survival. Her jacket's inner lining carried the faded 2nd Marine Division patch that General Rawlings had pressed into her hand in a Kandahar dust storm, the only piece of her past she'd carried into hiding. Now she wore it openly. She'd been appointed Director of Emergency Medical Training at Mercy General, mandate to overhaul veteran patient protocols. The position came with authority and the resources to ensure no patient would ever be denied care by corruption again. General Rawlings sat in the front row, recovered, his daughter beside him. His left forearm bore her name in faded ink, Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, permanent testimony to a debt that transcended years and continents. He caught her eye and nodded once, the kind of nod that said * welcome home star. Sarah's keynote address was brief. She didn't mention Sterling. The audience didn't need her to. They already knew the story. They'd seen it on the news. They'd watched the collapse of a man who'd tried to silence a hero. Instead, she talked about the Marines who'd taught her what duty meant. She talked about her husband Marcus, killed in a blast in Kandahar, the reason she'd run from her identity in the first place. She talked about the years she'd spent hiding, believing that running from trauma made it smaller when it only made her alone. I learned that healing isn't desertion, she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat monitor in a quiet room. And running from who you are doesn't make the pain stop. It just makes you invisible to the people who need you most. The audience rose. Not a quick standing ovation but a slow, deliberate rising, every person in that auditorium understanding that they were witnessing someone step back into her own light. After the ceremony, Emma Rawlings approached Sarah with her father's tattooed arm visible beneath his rolled sleeve, * Sarah Chen * still there in faded ink, preserved in skin for 13 years. He never forgot, Emma said quietly. He looked for you for years. Sarah's hand moved to the patch inside her jacket, the one she'd carried through every dark moment. I wasn't ready to be found. General Rawlings stepped forward, extended his hand, moved like a man still learning how to walk but choosing to do it anyway. Document. She took his hand. General. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop in Durham, 40 minutes away, Dr. Nathan Sterling taught a CPR basics class to 12 community college students. His hourly wage was $18. His medical license was under suspension pending federal charges. His name brought up news articles he couldn't escape. Nobody in that classroom knew who he was, and that, perhaps, was the most complete punishment available, the erasure of significance he'd spent his entire career trying to manufacture through intimidation and fraud. Sarah walked out of the conference center in her dress blues, sunlight catching the ribbons on her chest, her spine straight, her voice no longer deferential but commanding, no longer hiding but whole. She had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The kind of woman you didn't pick fights with. The kind of woman who'd already survived worse storms than any office politics could manufacture. The kind of woman who'd learned that true power wasn't about the title on a nameplate or the size of your paycheck. It was about the lives you chose to hold together when everything else was falling apart. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us about a time you stood firm when someone tried to silence you. Your story matters. Thank you for watching.